to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Good evening, lovely people. I am Neil Oliver and I am live, as far as I can tell, on GB News TV and on radio. Tonight, I'll be joined by North West Leicestershire MP Andrew Bridgen, who was one of the first politicians to raise the alarm about the Post Office scandal that saw hundreds of sub-postmasters wrongly convicted and imprisoned for fraud. He's bringing with him Michael Rudkin, who ran the Ibstock Post Office. He and his wife lost their jobs and were forced to turn their home into a B&B just to pay the bills. They now want to know who will be held to account for more than a decade of false incrimination and humiliation. And finally, farmers are blocking highways with trucks and tractors in parts of Germany in a week of protests against the German government's budget plans. But we'll be asking, why are they so angry? All of that and lots of chat with our regular panellist, Andrew Eborn. But first, an update on the latest news headlines from Tatiana Sanchez.
Neil, thank you. Your top stories from the GB Newsroom. 3 people have been arrested under the Terrorism Act, suspected of showing support for a proscribed organisation. They were detained during the pro-Palestinian rally, which saw thousands of people marching through central London. Police also arrested 2 people for carrying offensive placards. Protesters explained why it was important to take part.
People are being killed, 30,000 and more are being killed, kids are being killed, and no one is doing anything towards it. So we are asking the government, instead of supporting this, to stop it.
Make our voices heard against what's going on, the government's inaction.
No one is happy, that's why we see many people so against what's been happening between Palestine and Israel, This is at least we can do to support the people.
And I feel so passionately about it, and I don't see enough people standing up and saying no to this. So I just felt I had to be here.
What's happening is atrocious. There's too many international war crimes being committed, so no one's saying anything.
Yemen's Houthi rebels have promised a strong and effective response following a fresh strike by the United States. The US says it was a follow-up to a joint UK mission targeting Houthi positions. The West is trying to stop the Iranian-backed group from attacking ships in the Red Sea. President Joe Biden confirmed a private message was delivered to Tehran, making it clear the US is well prepared. Military analyst Sean Bell says America's strike was strategic, focusing on a specific site.
The US unilaterally did the strike last night. It's either that following yesterday, the Houthis launched another missile almost as an act of petulance. And it looks either in response to that, the US has struck this radar site, or after the strikes on Thursday night, battle damage assessment, they will have looked and said, one of the radar sites is still survived the attack. And therefore, they decided to use USS Carney to use another Tomahawk missile to actually take it out. It does seem to be a very surgical, measured response, and it is a unilateral response last night.
A former postmistress who's planning to run against Sarah Davey at the next general election says he must be brought to justice. The Lib Dem leader was Postal Affairs Minister during the Horizon IT scandal, but has refused to apologise or take any accountability for his inaction. Hundreds of staff were wrongly prosecuted after faulty software led to shortfalls in sub-postmasters' accounts. Sir Ed says he was lied to by the Post Office on an industrial scale. Speaking exclusively to GB News, Yvonne Tracy says she felt compelled to take a stand.
I would have loved it if we could have got a sub-postmaster who'd been affected by this to stand against Ed Davey, but I can understand that probably their confidence is not, and they probably are fed up to death with the government, etc. So I thought, it's going to be me. I'm reluctantly doing it, but I feel I have to do something, and this is all I can do. I think he should be brought to account.
Meanwhile, tax experts suggest the Post Office could be facing insolvency for failing to pay up to £100 million in tax. They say the company claimed £934 million tax relief on compensation paid to branch managers caught up in the Horizon scandal. Tax Policy Associates, the non-profit organisation, has described the practice as outrageous and potentially unlawful. The Post Office says its financial information is appropriate and accurate. Around 150 migrants have been intercepted in the Channel, ending the extended pause in crossings. On board 3 small boats, they're the first to make the treacherous journey since the 16th of December, the longest period without any migrant arrivals for almost 4 years. It's thought bad weather may have prevented more people from crossing the Channel over the past few weeks. And parts of the UK are bracing for an Arctic blast with more snow and sub-zero temperatures on the way. Yellow weather warnings for much of the north of Scotland come into force at midnight, and temperatures are expected to fall to as low as -5 degrees. The Met Office says the conditions could cause some disruption to travel. Those are your top stories on GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio, and on your smart speaker by saying Play GB News. Now back to Neil.
Saying that the lunatics have taken over the asylum used to be a joke. Now it's our day-to-day reality. The British regime, and I phrase it that way deliberately to take account of the fact the rot goes much deeper than just the government. Those empty sock puppets playing the parts of elected representatives took the decision last week to bomb Yemen. It goes without saying nowadays that we, the British people, were not consulted in advance, far less our blessing sought, for the making of more war on more people we don't know. Without any recourse to Parliament, that hollow charade supposedly comprising those sent by us to do our bidding and so take care of our best interests, ha ha ha, what nonsense, but which in reality is a mob of self-serving frauds who, if integrity was dynamite, couldn't blow their own noses. Without consulting that confederacy of dunces, unelected Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and unelected Foreign Secretary David Cameron and the rest of the goons dispatched warplanes to Yemen in our name. According to our government's own website, quote, on 11th of January, Royal Air Force aircraft joined coalition forces in striking a number of facilities used by the Houthi rebel faction in Yemen to attack shipping in the southern Red Sea, end quote. Thanks for telling us, lads. All-encompassing war in the Middle East, anyone? And so, in addition to helping underwrite the slaughter of generations of Ukrainian men and boys in the name of non-existent democracy and creeping NATO expansion and the carpet bombing of babies and the rest of the civilian population of Gaza, our taxes, the nation's wealth, as yet unearned and only added to the Himalayan mountain of debt, is being spent, you might say, securing the Red Sea. The Red Sea is more than 3,000 miles from London. RAF aircraft are dropping bombs on people there to help secure that waterway. And yet the British regime is incapable, or rather prohibited, from securing the English Channel that you can practically see from the roof of the Palace of Westminster. That's what you supposedly pay our taxes for, remember, at least in part, the security of our borders. I shouldn't need to say I'm not here calling for the bombing of the Channel, but in this time of lunacy, I will make clear I don't think it's too much to ask for a bit of effort to maintain a border. But while our unelected, self-promoted, self-described leaders rub their hands with glee at the prospect of further investing in the dividends payable by the military-industrial complex, the southern approaches to the United Kingdom are spread wide for the pleasure of all comers. Roll up, get your British taxpayer-funded free life here and help yourselves to whatever catches your eye while you're at it. Like us, the citizens of the US have no meaningful southern border. Millions of new people have arrived in recent years. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who declared the Big Apple a sanctuary state for immigrants cheerfully enough, now says it will cost $12 billion to house and care for the tens of thousands flooding the streets for the next 3 years. He said this year New York must spend $5 billion on its immigrants, more than it spends on police, fire and sanitation combined. Those on the move are victims too. It's the decisions by our so-called leaders to repeatedly bomb the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria and on and on and on that provokes the millions into moving elsewhere, including here. Is it a deliberate flooding of the West, a deliberate destabilising of the West, or just the byproduct of greed and corruption? I said at the top, the lunatics have taken over, but at best they're lunatics, because if it's not madness that drives them to drive the rest of us off a cliff, then it must be pure and simple badness. Hardly a soul in authority is prepared to talk about the excess dying every moment of every day here and in countries all around the world. 100,000 extra dead in the United Kingdom since January 2022, 30,000 more than all the British civilians killed in 6 years of World War II, and yet the official silence on the matter blows like tumbleweed down the corridors of power. And while young people drop dead and otherwise healthy people of all ages are harvested in hitherto unheard of numbers by heart disease and turbo cancer, our old friend Pfizer has been spending some of its recently acquired massive wealth buying companies that develop drugs to treat heart disease and turbo cancer. I don't know about you, but until just a few months ago, I'd never heard of turbo cancer. For me, the C word alone had always been scary enough. 4-cylinder, 5-gear kind of cancer, already capable of moving at lethal speed. All of a sudden now, though, we've got turbo cancer, fuel injected, maybe with a bottle of nitrous oxide on the side for that sudden terrifying burst of speed across the line to unexpected death. And dear old Albert Bourla, multi-millionaire boss of big pharma giant Pfizer that made billions pushing something they called a vaccine, but that was actually a gene therapy, boasts now about his company spending $43 billion to snap up Seagen, a small outfit specialising in treating turbo cancers, making Pfizer overnight the unchallenged global leader in cancer treatment. Bourla has been all over the media predicting turbo cancers will affect a third of the world in the years ahead, even declaring that entire families will be affected. No one asks him why, obviously, just a new fact of life. He delights in informing us that Pfizer will be able to produce Seagen's drugs at unprecedented scale, much like it was able to do with those mRNA-based injectables during the so-called pandemic. Pfizer have also spent more billions snapping up Arena Pharmaceuticals, another small company that specialises in treatments for immuno-inflammatory diseases, including myocarditis, the condition that has, oddly enough, in the past few years, stopped the hearts of an unprecedented number of otherwise fit and healthy youngsters, including elite sports people on the field of play. Quote, "We're excited to add the impressive experience and pipeline of Arena Pharmaceuticals to Pfizer's inflammation and immunology therapeutic area, helping us further our purpose of developing breakthroughs to change the lives of those with immunoinflammatory diseases," said Mike Gladstone, Global President and General Manager of Pfizer Inflammation and Immunology. The southern borders of the UK and the United States lie undefended. Millions of citizens spend sleepless nights fearful about the future, about paying bills, heating their homes and feeding their children. And yet, in another stunt at our expense, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak skips out of beleaguered and broken Britain to hug fellow homunculus Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and hand him another £2.5 billion we haven't even had the chance to earn yet. Quote, "Our support cannot and will not falter," he declares. "Britain is with you for as long as it takes," open brackets, regardless of how many British lives must lie in tatters or cold in the ground on account of my unelected, unasked for and unwanted contribution to the state of the nation, close brackets. If insanity is, as Albert Einstein said, endlessly repeating the same action in expectation of a different outcome, then the British electorate is collectively as mad as a cut snake for continually trusting more of the same politicians to care a jot whether we live or die, far less to act in anything approaching our best interests. The madness is all around the world. The scaffolding of nations is buckling under the weight of the lunacy and the wickedness of those in charge. In Germany, thousands upon thousands of farmers and other citizens have gathered to protest the spending of their taxes on endless wars, while those tasked with feeding the nation cannot afford to buy fuel for tractors. Instead of admitting mistakes, German politicians fall back on more name-calling, tossing around the far-right label in a doomed bid to silence the righteous. The truth is, our so-called leaders have no concern for the peoples of their countries. It's true in the United States, in Germany, all over Europe, and it's true here. In recent days, we've been invited to consider what happened to more than 900 British sub-postmasters, wrongly and shamefully prosecuted for theft, jailed, humiliated and otherwise destroyed, when in fact it was technology, trumpeted and installed by Tony Blair's government, that made the mistakes and unleashed the mayhem. The truth has been available in every way that matters for years, but it was denied, denied and denied again by all those responsible. A TV drama aired, and all at once the guilty were falling over one another to shed crocodile tears. Sir Ed Davey, now leader of the Lib Dems, but then the government's postal minister under Prime Minister David Cameron, trousered the better part of £250,000 while also serving the law firm that so aggressively and effectively targeted those sub-postmasters. Even as the evil was at its height, he refused to meet, far less to listen to those suffering the wrong of it all. Also turning a blind eye was Labour leader Sir Kier Starmer, sometime boss of public prosecutions. Prime Minister Sunak has had the unmitigated gall to take it upon himself to describe the destruction of nearly 1,000 lives as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history. Without doubt, those people are the victims of an obscene and unforgivable wrong. But to have to listen to more insincerity devoid of a grain of genuine empathy from the man presiding over so much else that's terribly amiss, the ongoing horror of excess dying, of undiscussed, unexplained causes in the aftermath of the so-called pandemic, ruinous lockdowns, the handing over of our unearned billions to perpetuate the profitable slaughter in Ukraine, the slaughter in Gaza, to attack Yemen in our name without our consent, is nothing more than salt rubbed in open wounds. At Harvard University, the very summit of aspiration in the US, the self-righteous intelligentsia of diversity, equity and inclusivity are running for cover, exposed like bedbugs from under a flipped mattress by a bright light, alleging plagiarism, which is what educated people call cheating. If the ideologues of woke, those demanding enthusiasm for, among other pursuits, the surgical mutilation of children, are stripped of their claims of expert status, on what other grounds could they possibly insist on lording it over us mere mortals, armed only with common sense and truth? And so here we are in a lunatic asylum governed at best by lunatics, at worst by cheats, liars and sociopaths. Here's the thing. Next week, the usual suspects, the billionaires and the bosses of transnational corporations and their assorted hangers-on will gather again in Davos in the mountains of Switzerland, there to plot more of the fate they have in mind for the pesky human race. The published agenda this time is about rebuilding trust. Trust in those mad clowns. What they need up there in Davos with their heads in the clouds are well-tailored straitjackets and padded cells. Joining me tonight is my friend, favourite regular panellists, lawyer, futurist, broadcaster, all-round good chap, Andrew Eborn. Andrew, you've heard me ranting there. It feels like politicians the world over are doing whatever they want without fear of consequence.
It is so worrying, and as you rightly say, the thing about trust, I mean, trust comes in on foot but leaves on horseback. And the reality is trust is at an all-time low in politicians, in the media, and so on and so forth. I'm talking about the turbocharge cancer, the whole word by its very nature. You say, what's that about? And it's all to do with fear. So Edward Bernays, the father of PAR, said that the way you sell anything is through fear, the most powerful human emotion. And what we need to look at is actually the positive things like AI, which are finding solutions and helping cure diseases.
Yeah, but hold on. Where is the turbo cancer coming from? I mean, I can't be the only person that until a few months ago had never heard of such a thing.
Well, you and me both.
So the sudden prevalence of turbo cancer, and lo and behold, a £43 billion deal by Pfizer to pick up a company that has pharmaceuticals to treat turbo cancer.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Doesn't that require investigation and some questions?
And what I love about this show is we always question everything. We don't just regurgitate what we're being peddled. But it's going back to what I was saying about fear. The word turbo cancer means that it's much, much worse than any cancer we've ever. And cancer always used to be the big C, which was the big scary thing anyway. So turbo cancer, by its very nature, has got to be much worse than anything we've ever imagined. And so where does that come from? I've got no idea. They're not explaining it to us, other than turbo is by its very nature a fear word.
So there's a sequence of events whereby something happens, then there's the rollout of a vaccine, then suddenly we're being talked to about myocarditis, pericarditis, turbo cancer. And then no sooner are we learning to digest those words than Pfizer are acquiring companies to treat those conditions.
Absolutely. It's going back to what I was saying beforehand about fear. That's the way you're selling this sort of message. Get really scared, and here's the solution. It's all about that. Edward Bernays, he talked about the Dixie cups. You might remember about disposable cups. He was engaged to help sell these cups, these disposable ones. And what he said, well, hang about, you're going to get infections if you keep using the same cup, and therefore we've got to do these disposable ones. And all of a sudden he said, that's the way you've got to tell it. You peddle the message in the media that cups are very bad for you because they're not washed properly, so you've got to get these disposable ones. And that's how it all came about in that first place.
Snake oil salesman everywhere you look. We're already at a break, after which I'll be joined by Andrew Bridgen, MP, to talk about his fight to help the sub-postmasters wrongly accused of stealing from the post office. Don't go away.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel. Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock Monday to Thursday on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
My next guest this evening is MP Andrew Bridgen, who has spent the last 10 years and more fighting for justice for the sub-postmasters in his constituency, those who were wrongly convicted of theft theft from the post office. Andrew joins me now. Good evening, Andrew. Good to see you again. When did you become aware of this exactly, and in what way?
Well, it's actually 14 years ago when I was elected. Within weeks of being elected as a newly Conservative MP, I had a surgery appointment booked with Mr and Mrs Rudkin, and they told me what at the time appeared to be an unbelievable story of how they were falsely convicted of fraud. They were actually fitted up by the post office and Fujitsu. My constituent Michael Rudkin had been a successful sub-postmaster for years with no problems, a pillar of the local society, community in Ibstock. He'd been actually selected as the representative for all the sub-postmasters in the UK. He'd gone on a visit to Fujitsu's headquarters in that position. He believed they'd mistaken him for someone else, and they actually took him down into the basement and showed their engineers altering Horizon. This is in 2008. And when they discovered who he was, they threw him out the building. He came back to Ibstock, and very, very shortly afterwards, they were raided, and they were accused of taking £44,000 shortfall on the computer, and his wife was convicted of fraud.
And it's the fact that people have died since. People committed suicide because of their desperation and whatever else. People are still in jail. The convictions have not all been quashed. What on earth is going on that despite it all being out in the open, people are still languishing under the guilt of conviction?
Well, there's at least 736 sub-postmasters convicted on Horizon evidence alone. The Post Office had always maintained it was impossible to alter the computer records in a sub-postmaster's office without them knowing about it. That was untrue, as Mr Rudkin had uncovered, and so it was always going to be their fault, and there was no glitches in the system, which that was untrue as well. So we knew all those convictions were unsafe by 2014. Oliver Letwin was in the group of 5 MPs. He was in the Cabinet Office, and he was David Cameron's political advisor. I'd have no doubt he was briefing the Prime Minister at the time on something as important as what we'd uncovered.
At what point did those in positions to do something about it know that the sub-postmasters were innocent? How long has that been?
Well, I managed to... We ambushed the post office. They were maintaining their system was bomb-proof, so I managed to get a really diligent forensic accountant who I'd become acquainted with, called Ron Warmington of Second Sight. He got in there, and very shortly afterwards, it was clear that the system was very, very leaky, and that all those convictions were unsafe. So certainly by 2014, I knew, I believe the government knew, and the post office knew, and the sub-postmasters knew.
I was oblivious to the horror of this. However, that said, I mean, on here, in this show, a couple of years ago now, more than a couple of years ago, we had on Nick Wallace, an author who had spent time investigating. I think there's a clip.
In 2010, the Post Office was made aware of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance and the fact that they had the backing of several MPs. However, they did nothing about it. They denied that anything was wrong until in 2012, a group of independent forensic accountants called Second Sight were brought in by the Post Office to look at their Horizon computer system. And Second Sight found that there were faults, there were errors.
Now, I mean, needless to say, you know, nothing happened in the aftermath.
Well, I told the government, you can't let the Post Office pay for their own investigation. It's got to be paid by the Cabinet Office, or else the moment that Ron finds anything and Second Sight find anything, they'll get shut down. And that's exactly what happened. In the end, Ron Warmington, because he's a man of high morals, leaked the unredacted information to me because the Post Office were redacting all his reports to cover it all up, even at that point in 2012.
Andrew, as a lawyer, listening to this with your legal hat on, what's your
it's completely
scandalous.
I mean, and there's a number of things here. You hear of the tragic cases where people have said, look, if you plead guilty to fraudulent accounting, you may not go to prison. And basically, people who were innocent were forced to plead guilty. And we always say, baby lawyers, the first thing you're told is better that 99 guilty people get off than one innocent person gets convicted. And it's completely scandalous. The whole thing about the fact it took an ITV drama to bring this to light is extraordinary. What I also say, there's a number of other questions that need to be raised in terms of they denied the fact afterwards that he ever visited Fujitsu.
I rang up, spoke to Fujitsu, wrote to them and said, I'm writing on behalf of my constituent, Mr Rudkin. He says he visited your head office at Bracknell on this date, and they first of all claimed that he'd never been on the premises. And then I said, well, he says he claims that he signed the visitors book. And, of course, they said they'd lost the visitors book for that day. And the emails all came out, a whistleblower from Fujitsu eventually, and everything that... the unbelievable story of fraud and false criminalisation that my constituents had told me those years before, everything was true.
It is extraordinary. And the other thing as well, which hasn't come out yet, is about Adam Crozier. Because Adam Crozier, at that time, was head of Royal Mail. I think from 2003 to 2010, he then went from the head of Royal Mail to ITV. And he doesn't feature at all in the drama. And I don't know why that is.
Why does it take a drama? That sounds almost farcical, that after all of the testimony, all of the truth-telling, all the way down the line, why, when a drama goes out on television, does it suddenly tip
Well, it was a well-made drama, and it pulled on the heartstrings, as the story does. I mean, it's deeply distressing when you meet the victims themselves. But the fact is, I find abhorrent, is that I had been to ITV, BBC, Sky, Channel News and all the major newspapers. I had all the evidence that the convictions were unsafe in 2014, and I went for years and nobody would run the story. I said to the journalists, you'll get an award if you run this story. These people are all innocent and here's the proof. No media outlet would run that story.
What will it cost to put it right? There's vast amounts of money in terms of legal fees and all of the rest of it. You know, what's the bill and who foots it?
It's going to be the taxpayer, whatever happens. Ultimately, the Post Office is owned by the government, so we'll foot the bill. But they've got to have proper compensation. I managed to get Mrs Rudkin in the first 9 that had her criminal prosecution overturned. Right. And that was in December 2020. Mr and Mrs Rudkin still haven't got their compensation.
What about Fujitsu? I mean, Fujitsu's a private company, and doesn't it carry the
Well,
can
I think
in
the
part?
fact that they, as far as I'm concerned, it's no coincidence that after Mr Rudkin uncovered what was going on in 2008, that his wife had suddenly got a huge deficit on her computer within days. Now, that is criminal.
Hold you on that word there, that C word there. It's a break, after which I'll be joined by Sub-Postmaster, the man in question that we've been talking about, Michael Rudkin, to talk about his battle for justice. Don't go away.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. My next guest is Michael Rudkin. Michael ran a post office in Ibstock with his wife Susan. He was also chair of the National Sub-Postmasters Federation. Their lives changed forever when they were accused of taking £44,000. Michael joins me now. Michael, it's an appalling catalogue of events which we've all been piecing together over the last, weeks or years depending. But what has this done to you and Susan? Where are you now physically and emotionally? And
I can tell you that emotionally, we're both physically drained and wrecked as a result of what's transpired. What's little known is we came into this industry in 1995, Susan and I, and we were privileged to be selected by the Post Office to actually run a branch, so much so that we were then granted the second branch, of which we ran that as well in conjunction with the other branch. It then came to the point where my sons didn't want to follow on in the business because they were so disillusioned with what was transpiring and they could see what was happening to mum and dad that they chose a different career path.
But I can only imagine that, traditionally you would have been regarded as, pillars of the community. The local post office is a significant place for a lot of people. And what happened to you going from that, a pillar, to suddenly being accused and put in the spotlight of being a thief?
Well, that was a very difficult moment in my life in particular, because I've got a double-edged sword. One is I appear to have fallen from grace, and B, I'm in a position where I've got to defend the position of my wife, because I knew for a fact that Susan wouldn't ever take a penny piece from anybody, and yet there she is, accused. They couldn't get at me but as a union rep, but then they decided they were going to focus their attentions on Susan, and they prosecuted her.
And how do you feel about the fact that you've yet to receive any compensation? Or are you getting any kind of apology from anyone about what you went through?
Well, I in particular have had an interim payment, which is very small. The fact that we've got Susan, who is part of the group that were prosecuted, of which we've got just under 1,000 that are waiting for their convictions to be overturned, where we've got also 90-some that have had the convictions overturned, and that's taken up to now 20 years. Are you really asking me to believe that it's going to take another decade before the rest of the sub-postmasters are cleared?
Gents, how can this be? How can, when we know that there was, the people are innocent, why are there still outstanding?
Absolutely scandalous. And that, what Sunak was saying this week is they want to basically push forward everything. They're going to forgive everybody, as I understand it.
Forgive?
Even if, no, that's what I know. Well, even those who may be guilty, they're just pardon and say, look, completely exonerated, because it is scandalous. We were chatting in the green room beforehand. Because what happens? You were vilified in the community as well, and I think you're saying that lots of people who were assumed that you were guilty, they've come and apologised. They're ringing you on your doorbell now, leaving presents and saying just how sorry they are on that sort of thing. But one question I've got in terms of the ITV drama, you talked about Sean Dooley, I think, played you. To what extent were you part of that narrative and actually helping them with writing the script and so on and so forth?
Well, it's difficult to explain because there were so many different avenues. But I had a Zoom call with Sean.
Yes.
Because he wanted to get it to grips with my character. He put questions to me to see what kind of reaction he would get so that he would have empathy with that and then to be able to portray it within the dramatisation, of which I have to say, yet again, the guy had done an excellent job, as did the rest of the actors that participated in this programme. I want to cover one other point with you, Andrew.
Yes.
That you mentioned about the statement from Sunak in Parliament giving everybody the so-called pardon.
Yes.
What is dangerous about this, what we need to see is the detail. The devil is in the detail. And for somebody to stand there and say that we will do this, but we want a statement of innocence, for everybody to sign it, and if at some point in the future we think you may have done something wrong, we will be able to come back and have redress against that. Well, we've already experienced what happens when the judge and jury becomes the executioner. I wouldn't want to see any of my members, former members, put in that position
So it's
again.
understandable you wouldn't have faith in the system. What would you like to see happen?
What I would like to see happen is for people to get their act together and start issuing proper compensation levels. I hate this term when they say, we want to restore you back to where you were when this started. I'm 66 next, in a couple of months. I don't want to be back where I was. I want to know how I'm going to fund the next 20 years of my retirement. And it's not with an interim payment of £75,000.
We can't have pardons, because you get pardons when you've done something wrong and you're forgiven.
It's the wrong language.
They've got to be exonerated because these people did not commit any crimes.
And also, Andrew, though, you know, the technology was trumpeted and put in place by Tony Blair. The whole scandal unfolded under David Cameron's government. You know, Ed Davey, as it turns out, was the postal minister who was simultaneously taking money from the legal firm chasing the postmistresses falsely and the postmasters. Who's going to carry the can for this? When will we get somebody who actually stands up and says, this was me? Kier Starmer, you know, was in some way either turning a blind eye or in some way didn't see what was happening.
Well, after I got, Michael, a Zoom meeting with Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, that's when we got the public inquiry. I still haven't given my evidence to the public inquiry. When the evidence is complete, I think we've got to hold all these characters to account, and certainly Fujitsu, certainly ministers, it's what they knew, when they knew it, and why they didn't act. Because this can't be allowed to happen again, and I think history's repeated itself too many times. Yeah. You know, 11 years over thalidomide, 30 years over the Gulf War syndrome, the infected blood's still not been paid out, those victims. This is deliberate.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We always say history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history, and this absolute scandal needs to be addressed. But looking at that sort of side, you went to Fujitsu, they tried to hide that.
Well, the fact that they turn around and say I didn't exist, I never appeared that day.
Right.
I mean, that's really pushing the pale. I've signed the invitation book. Security level in that building is absolutely unparalleled on anything I've ever experienced. But then also the shock of being taken down into the boiler room to watch these experiments happening at altering remotely branches' accounts
2008.
And when challenged and specifically asked twice, are you doing this real time?
Yes.
Reply, yes. I need to ask you again. Are you doing this real time? Response, yes. I've told my members that no remote access can be done through a remote location. The accounts belong to the postmaster and only he can sign them off when completed, and you have entered them remotely.
And of course.
And then to be ushered out of the building as though I'm some common criminal.
Yeah. Outrageous, and that came screamingly through in the drama. The other question, of course, is where is the money? Because if you're turning around and saying there was a deficit, the sub-posts that well, we should answer in their profits, probably.
I know where it is. Very early on in the investigation, anyone who's dealt with accounts, double entry bookkeeping, every account system has a suspense account. That's where you put items until you know where to put it properly.
Right.
The suspense account on Horizon was mysterious. In this bomb-proof system was normally in credit at the end of the year between £1 million and £1.5 million. And after 4 years, the post office directors were just pushing that £1.5 million a year into profits. Well, in a bomb-proof system, you don't have £1.5 million of uncompleted transactions in surplus. I think if you add all that money up for 15, 20 years, that's the money that was extorted.
So people need to look at that. So the sub-post office master who basically had to make up the apparent deficit when there was no deficit out of their own money.
It's a bit more complicated. Fujitsu had told the post office it was a bomb-proof system.
Yeah.
The post office put them on a penalty clause, £20 penalty clause for every non-completed transaction. They'd got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds every day. They paid engineers to fix them instead of paying over the penalty clause. And human nature being what it is as well, someone's going to press the wrong key, and instead of having a £20, £30, £40 problem, you've got a bigger problem, and they were never going to admit to it.
Do you know what's interesting as well? In the wider context, we're all being pushed towards technology, artificial intelligence, and all of the rest of it.
Make mistakes.
Our lives are going to be better because these things are infallible. And you look at this, you look at the lives destroyed, and you look at the willingness with which politicians from highest to lowest were ready to say that machine is infallible, and therefore it must be the humans who got it.
And also, Fujitsu have got lots of contracts across government and
several billion.
And I think, there was certainly the child maintenance service, which has been heavily criticised by the National Audit Office. They certainly had a Fujitsu system in until at least 2021, and there's lots of people who have committed suicide because of being chased for arrears there.
Michael, a last question to you: is there anything that can compensate you realistically? This is more than 10 years. This is 10 years of your life that you don't get back. Realistically, what could put you ahead of the game again?
Susan and I might not get that 10 years back, but I tell you what we don't want. We don't want this apathy and pathetic, I'm sorry, I apologise. I want my life and that of my wife's financially back on track so we can see the rest of our years out. Now, it was raised earlier about the competency of the Fujitsu system. I was also privy at the time, whilst in office, that there was something called the Highland account. Now, people were going in and they were paying their electric bills and this, that and the other, and they were getting the receipts. And then all of a sudden, because they were on budget programmes, the service provider got on and they said, you haven't made your weekly payment. Where's the money? We're going to have to take you off the scheme. Those people ran back straight away to the post office and produced the receipts and said, where's the money gone? We then find out post office hushed it up very quickly, and believe me, very quickly, because this is the first time this issue has been raised. And the reason that they hushed it up, because that money for the Highland account, for the gas and electric and telephone, the money that was being paid in weekly actually was directed into that account until the public started to raise a fuss. Then it was stopped, it was closed down, and the money was reimbursed.
A whole other story there, Michael. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for speaking so frankly and honestly about what this has been like for you. Thank you also, Andrew Bridgen, once again, for turning the spotlight on something that matters. I'm on another break, I'm afraid, after which I'll be joined by academic and Emeritus Professor of Sociology Frank Furedi. We'll be talking about the German farmers, why they're protesting. Don't go anywhere.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests, and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here we are together again. Now, German farmers this time have begun a week of nationwide demonstrations, protests, blocking roads with tractors and all of the rest. It's protest against government plans to phase out agricultural subsidies, which all sounds very dry. However, those farmers are not alone. Lorry drivers and hauliers and others, people like you and me have joined in the protests. We'll be following this up in far more detail next week because it's a story that will run and run. But for now, I wanted to get a sense of exactly what's happening in Germany. And to do that, I'm joined from Brussels by the academic and social commentator, Frank Ferreri. Frank, good evening. Thanks for joining me.
Hi there. Nice to talk to you.
Can you give us, first of all, a sense of the scale? You have seen stuff online, but just how big a protest are we talking about?
This is really massive. It's quite unprecedented because it covers the whole of Germany. And not only does it include farmers, but as you were suggested, ordinary peoples are getting stuck in. Something like 68% of the German population is backing the farmers. That's according to the state television survey that they've carried out. And I've talked to several people who've been on these demonstrations who indicate that what they're really seeing here is a genuine movement who feel that their whole way of life is now under attack because they're not just simply rebelling and protesting against the economic cost of environmentalism in Germany, but what they are really scared about and worried about is that the whole rural way of life will be undermined. It's not just simply, as far as they're concerned, about their jobs, but a way of life. These are people who for generations have lived on the land. And you know, we have a situation where ever since the beginning of this century, almost half of German farms have closed down because of all these new regulations that have been brought in and all the economic costs that they've been forced to bear as a result of net zero policies.
You mentioned net zero. Can you expand on that? You know, what is the overarching ideology that's motivating this attack? And it is an attack on farmers and farming, not just in Germany, but frankly all over the world.
It's very difficult to explain, but it almost seems to have the character of a religious crusade, where you just assume that if you emit carbon, then in some shape or form, you know, you've committed a sin. And these people who think that we have got to stop carbon emissions from occurring often go so far as to imagine that having less babies, for example, is a duty, is a moral duty. And some people in Australia have even suggested that if you have more than 2 babies as a family, you should pay a carbon tax on the 3rd baby. So instead of seeing a little baby, a beautiful little baby coming to this world, what they say is a bit of carbon that is creating problem for society. And when you have that kind of mindset, then it's not surprising that when it comes to attacking the farmers, what they really want is to substantially reduce animal husbandry. They're basically putting all kinds of taxes on farming equipment. They are also cutting some of the support systems that have been in place for years. For example, the support that the government has provided for diesel fuel. And all that would make farming a very, very difficult enterprise. But worse still, imagine you're a farmer and you've invested all this money in your land and you assume that these are the rules that you have to farm by. But a year later, you're told that the rules have changed because now we have new net zero policies. And 6 months after that, there are even more new rules that come in. And I've talked to farmers in Europe who literally spend their weekends working with the red tape that's almost kind of destroying their way of life. And they're kind of looking at the paperwork all the time. And essentially what they feel is happening is just when they think they understand the demands that are being placed upon them by the net zero lobbyists, new rules come along to erode their way of life.
Frank, I'm going to have to wind this up just because of shortage of time. As I said, and as I hope you appreciate, we're going to pick this up in much more detail next week. But thank you so much for that. As I've said before, and others like me, we are the carbon that they're trying to reduce. That's it from me this week. Thanks to my guests, Andrew Bridgen MP, Michael Rudkin, Frank Furedi and Andrew Eborn. I'll see you next Saturday. Next up, the Saturday 5.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Fortry here of our GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. We've got a mixture of variable cloud and some clear spells to end this first half of the weekend, and that is quite key in terms of what conditions you will see overnight. Well, you do see some of those clearer spells. Temperatures could just drop off a touch with some pockets of frost developing, mist and fog patches as well. But those areas that hold on to the cloud will probably see temperatures just hold up slightly above freezing. Many of our towns and cities around 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. So not a widespread frost, but still a chilly start to Sunday morning. A reasonable amount of cloud holding on for Wales, central southern England throughout Sunday as well. A few sunnier breaks to watch out for, but it's the northern half of the UK where we'll see some slightly more prolonged areas of sunshine. Showers though across northern Scotland will be falling as snow even to lower levels. Combine that with some very strong winds across the northeast. They've got the risk of drifting snow and feeling very bitter in those winds. Even towards the south, a fairly cold day, 6-7 degrees Celsius. But it's that very cold Arctic air in the north that's going to sweep its way southwards over the course of Sunday and into Monday. There's blue colours covering the entirety of the UK. So some of us will certainly have to scrape the cars first thing on Monday morning. The showers will be continuing to push their way into the north, primarily from northern Scotland, but we'll see also some snow showers for Northern Ireland, perhaps a few for the far west of Wales, southwest England, as well as skirting into Humberside and parts of Norfolk as well. Further inland, widespread blue skies, but feeling very cold, and the cold conditions continue right throughout the week. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar. sponsors of weather on GB News.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good evening, friends. It's Saturday night, and this is the Saturday Five. I'm Ben Leo, along with Darren Grimes, Nana Akweer, Benjamin Butterworth, and Belinda DeLucy. Tonight on the show, forget Rwanda. We need to turn migrant boats back in the water, just like Australia.
And I'm afraid, folks, that it's time to get pretty real when it comes to the fact that these protests are still going on.
And it's time to boost Britain's defence and champion the alpha in our armed forces.
Get a grip, King Charles. It's time to kick Prince Andrew out of his posh lodge.
And sparks will fly when I get stuck into EVs. Who wants one?
Love that pun, Nano. It's 7 p.m. and this is the Saturday Five.